I'm the director of the Futures programme at the Smith School, so I'm responsible for two different types of activity. And one of those is, how do we harness the future and learn with alternative futures to understand our options for acting in the present? And the other is, when we look at how futures practices are working, what can we learn in terms of value and use? Because there's a lot of future studies produced, but are they actually effectively used? And what can use tell us about what's useful? So scenarios are one method in the Modern Futures Toolkit, and they're increasingly being used in relation with other forms of methods such as forecasting or computer-based modelling or visioning. And each of these methods has its own strengths, and it's also got its own Achilles heel. But scenarios are interesting because they don't promise prediction. They actually encourage us to keep an open mind about the fact that we live in an uncertain world, and that uncertainty is both empowering, not just frightening. And so the role of scenarios, I think, is to help leaders individually and collectively, and organisations and societies, keep an open mind. And if we can keep an open mind, we can see more things that are happening, and we can also prepare more options for what might happen. The World Forum, if I attend to the World Forum, in many parts of society, in different regions of the world, we have a real problem. And our problem is we don't know how to move beyond problem conferences. We understand how to do conferences and meetings which tell us that we have a lot of problems. We know how to put problems on the table. We seem to be experiencing great difficulty in taking problems off the table or moving them forward. And so the World Forum really tries to convene across academia, across scholars, with business and with governments to try and say, how can we rethink these problems today, and how can we reimagine the futures that might be possible? And so we harness in this problem-focused conference attention to how the future could unfold differently. And we do that for two very good reasons. One is that we have, in terms of biodiversity, we have attended to biodiversity futures much less than we have to energy or climate. So I can find you 1,000 energy scenarios, I can find you hundreds of climate change scenarios, I can find you a handful of biodiversity futures. Another challenge is that the biodiversity futures that are being produced are often being produced by governments in national ecosystems assessments, or they're being produced by scholars. But they're not actually relating in any way to the futures work that's being produced by corporations and governments around their national strategies or their corporate strategies. And so we have this sort of like dialogue of the deaf, where different sides are producing interesting futures thinking, but they're not actually connected together. And I think if we connect across these different communities of practice, what we'll start to see that is, whilst business has moved to an increasingly vigilant watch on biodiversity and has become very interested in concepts of ecosystems markets, I think there's a huge underappreciation that the time horizon for making real strategic choices is approaching us from the future rapidly, and that we don't have this luxury of time of 20 or 30 years before we start to think about what's going to happen. So within the World Forum, I hope that we can harness learning with futures to try and raise the understanding of that the solutions that we've currently come forward with out of Nagoya are not sufficient. And they're not sufficient because we don't really have a whole understanding, and that whole understanding isn't shared across public, private and academe. The forum is one of the flagship engagement platforms of the Smith School. And when I use the word engagement, I want to separate it out from the word that usually used is communication. And communication is often, wow, we found this out, now we're going to tell you all about it. We found out there's a problem, and now we're going to ask you to address it, or we're going to tell you how to address it. And we use the forum as a way of listening and connecting and rethinking what's going on. So we deliberately use the forum to convene across academia, business and government. We try and get a respect for different views going. We try to get to grips with the nitty-gritty of what's going on and the uncomfortable aspects of what's going on. So the World Forum on Biodiversity starts with a premise that actually Nagoya is not enough. That actually what's been achieved at Nagoya in terms of what's been negotiated might itself be remarkable, but it's not sufficient. And so how do we move beyond something that's just been agreed to reopening that conversation and moving it a little bit further? And there's a saying that says, failure is a bastard. Well, if you want success, you better cultivate parents. And we're cultivating parents across business, government and academia. And these parents are going to have remarkable children that live long beyond their birth. And we hope, I think, I always think of myself as an intellectual midwife. I'm not here to tell people what the ideas are or what the solutions are, but I am here to make us have better conversations, times where we turn ideas over together, and in turning them over we see things that we haven't seen before, and we realise things that are not easy to address, that actually what we've agreed is not going to do the job.